Looks like we're live, Daniel. We are good to go. Go ahead and kick us off for session 3, talking through the best practice analyzer.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Okay, so yeah, as Mike said, today's topic is the best practice analyzer of Tabular Editor, and I'm actually really happy to have the chance to present this webinar for you today. This is actually the first time I have the opportunity to go into the best practice analyzer in more detail and tell people about what it is, what it can do, how to use it, how to set it up, and so on. Because most of the times when I'm presenting Tabular Editor, giving a general overview, I normally only have time to just give a quick glimpse of the best practice analyzer. But today we'll spend the full session going into details about what it is and how to use it and so on. So just like the last couple of times, shoot any questions that you may have around the topics that I'm talking about into the chat. Mike will help me moderate, and I'll take a couple of breaks along the way to catch up on the questions.
Yep.
And yeah, I hope you enjoy the show. All right. So before going into the demo, which is obviously where I'm going to spend most time today, once again. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what the best practice analyzer is on the slide deck. We'll also make sure that the slides are made available, because there's some useful links within these slides, so that you can go back afterwards and get to these articles and resources that I'm linking to inside the slide deck. So first of all, the best practice analyzer actually was not my idea. I have to give credit to one of my colleagues called David, who suggested this on the GitHub site way back in 2017. So full disclosure, this was completely his idea to incorporate to provide this rules engine inside the best practice analyzer. And actually, I believe David was inspired from a little feature we had back in the good old days of multidimensional modeling back in Analysis Services 2008 or something like that. Where Visual Studio would continuously scan the multidimensional model that you had set up and provide any warnings or informational messages around things that you had set up. So for those of you who don't know, multidimensional models were actually way more complex than tabular models. And so there were a lot of things that you could do wrong, and certain things that could impact the performance in a bad way if you didn't take care about setting things up correctly. But back then, Visual Studio helpfully informed us whenever we forgot to set up attribute relationships or did not create user hierarchies and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that's actually where David got his idea when he suggested it on GitHub for Tabular Editor. So basically what it is it's a fully customizable rules engine. It uses an expression language. Yesterday I talked about how we can use scripting with C# inside Tabular Editor. And C# has a feature called LINQ, Language Integrated Query, which is actually the same kind of syntax that we're using when we are defining the rules for the best practice analyzer, as you'll see in a moment. It's also possible to specify a very short script snippet inside the rules themselves in order to be able to generate a fix script, so that if you have any objects that are in violation of a particular rule, and it only takes setting a single property or something like that in order to fix the issue, well, then you can actually automate that. So you can make it very easy for anyone using your best practice rules to actually correct the mistakes that they made. And I'm also going to show you how that works in a little bit. So the idea behind the rules is that they can analyze the full tabular object model of your tabular model metadata. So basically, the rules can traverse the entire hierarchy, the JSON hierarchy that I've talked about a couple of times in the last couple of sessions. Once again, to gain the most from this tool, I highly suggest you take some time to look into the tabular object model itself, to familiarize yourself with it if you're not that much into it already. Because just knowing about how the various objects are related to one another, how the structure is, the fact that you have a model at the top level, and then below the model you have tables, hierarchies, levels, and so on in this hierarchical structure. Just getting to know that stuff is a tremendous help when you're trying to author your own best practice rules. Then once you have the rules defined and they're running inside Tabular Editor, they will continuously scan your model in the background. So every time you make a single change to your model, the entire rules engine will actually execute again on a background thread, and you'll get the count of objects that are in violation of any rules right there in the main UI. So it's very easy to use. It's very easy to bring up. And one other thing is that you can even invoke the best practice analyzer through Tabular Editor's command line interface. And this will be very useful when we are going to talk about DevOps in more detail on tomorrow's session, because this actually lets you make some kind of unit testing or some kind of validation that you can incorporate into your build pipelines in Azure DevOps to make sure that your models live up to certain standard best practices and so on before you deploy them anywhere. So the next slide here shows a screenshot of the UI, and we're going to go into much more detail about this for managing the best practice rules that are available. Just a couple of notes is that the rules themselves are stored as JSON objects, and they can be stored in a couple of places. You could have the rules sitting inside the actual model that you're working on. In that case, the rules will be stored as annotations within the model, so they won't impact anything regarding analysis services or DAX queries, anything like that. It'll just be like extra metadata that you put into the model.bin file or your Power BI template file or whatever. But you could also have the rules placed somewhere else, either on an external URL or maybe a local file that you have somewhere on a file share or something like that. And then you can just put a reference to that file inside your model so that you can have a central repository somewhere in your organization of rules that you want to include in your models. And then each model would simply just reference that external file. In addition to that, you could also have your own local user file that only applies to you locally for when you log into your machine. And in sort of the same way, you can also have a file that resides locally to the machine. So if you're multiple developers that are using the same terminal server when you're building your tabular models, then you can have a file that contains rules which are shared across all users of the same machine. So that's sort of the various places where you can actually store the definition of these best practice rules. Once you have a model, there can be situations in which you actually want to ignore certain rules, either completely at the rule level, if you want to ignore the entire rule. Maybe for some reason a rule around naming conventions or something like that does not apply to the particular model you're working with. So in that case, you can choose to ignore that particular rule. But you can also ignore rules at the object level. So if for some reason you have a single object which is in violation of a particular rule, and you want to ignore just that one object for some reason, well, then it's possible to do that as well. And information about which rules or objects are ignored will also be stored as annotations within the model itself. On GitHub, you can find a small set of standard rules that are available. This is actually a very important point. So when you first download and install Tabular Editor, you'll see that there are no rules available inside the tool itself. At some point, I actually want to include a set of standard rules with the installation itself. But so far, this has been more of an experimental thing. And I've been talking to some of the SQL BI guys, trying to figure out which kind of rules would actually apply in maybe not all, but at least in most cases, and then we try to come up with something that will be widely applicable to everyone. And at that point, we will consider adding this set of standard rules inside the tool itself. But for now, you can find these rules as a JSON file on GitHub, so that you can easily download them or reference them directly inside Tabular Editor to get them into your models. If you want to create your own rule, or if you want to modify existing rules, that's another interface for that. You need to supply a couple of information points here. So you need to provide a name for the rule. This will be shown to the user of Tabular Editor, so the Tabular Model developer. You also need to provide an ID, because it could be the case that you have multiple rules with the same ID from different sources. So for example, if you decided to reference a library of rules from GitHub, and those rules already define a particular rule with a certain ID, but then again you want to override that rule with something else, well then you can reuse the same ID on a rule that you store locally inside the model or in some other place where it has higher precedence. and then it will override the other rule that has the same ID. I don't know if that makes much sense. It'll probably be clearer in a little bit when I show you the tool live. You can also specify a severity level, and the severity level itself is not really being used for anything inside Tabular Editor, but when you invoke the best practice analyzer through the command line interface, there's a command line switch you can use to provide different messages, different output from the command line, depending on the severity level of the rules. So the way it's set up is that whenever a rule has a severity level of 1, then it's only going to show up as a simple information message in the output of the command line. Whereas a rule with a severity level of 2 will give a warning message, and a rule with a severity level of 3 will give an error message. So there's these 3 different levels that something like Azure DevOps can react to in different ways, and we'll see that in the session tomorrow as well. Finally, you can provide a category. This is just a logical grouping of rules. If you want to have that, it's not really being used for anything other than displaying the rules in the UI ordered by category. You can provide a description to show some more details about what the rule is supposed to do and what we can do to fix the issue. And finally, you need to specify which types of objects the rule should apply to. So there's this drop-down where you can select multiple types of objects. So for example, you can specify whether a rule should apply to measures or columns or calculated columns, or any kind of object inside the Tabular object model. And then finally, we have the expression field where you should specify this link expression that I talked about a moment ago. And this is the expression that will be evaluated for every object of the particular type that you selected in the drop-down button. And wherever this expression validates to true, you would have a violation of the rule. So in the example on this screenshot I have here, well, in this case, I decided to create a rule at the model level. So in this case, since you only ever have a single model when the best practice analyzer is running, this rule would never report more than a single object being in violation. So either the model would be in violation of this rule or it wouldn't be. And the rule in this particular case is that the number of measures across all tables on the model, that's this special property called all measures at the model level, should be larger than 0. So basically it means that if our model does not contain any measures at all, then we're going to get a rule violation at the model level. But as long as we have just a single measure on this model, well, then the rule is going to be satisfied, and we're not going to see any issues in this case. So before I switch over to the demo, are there any questions at this point, Mike?
Nope, don't have any questions yet, so we're good to go. Keep cruising.
Absolutely. Okay. So in the slide deck you'll find a link to this Git repository where we have this collection of rules, and in particular in a moment you'll see me try to import one of the rule files that we have here. That's the one called bpa rules-standard.json. And what you do is, if you go to GitHub and you click on that link, and you can see here the GitHub page that displays the actual JSON file here with all the rule definitions. What you want to do is you want to click on the raw button here. So this button up here, if you click on this, you get a link that only gives you the JSON document and nothing else. And this URL that you have up here is one you can actually reference from inside Tabular Editor. And you can bring this into your models, and then basically you'll get all these rules for free into your model and get your model validated against these rules. Now, at this point, I'd like to take a minute to just let you know that if you want to implement specific rules, but you're not sure how to do that using the dynamic link expression and all that stuff, please feel free to post an issue on this GitHub issue tracker. And you, as long as you can just explain with plain English words what you want the rule to do, that's perfectly fine. Just submit it here. I'll be happy to write up the link expression that you would need to create a rule that catches what you want it to catch. So if you have anything regarding, I don't know, naming conventions or something that you want to enforce for your particular type of model, feel free to let me know here. I'd be happy to provide the sample code that you would need in order to implement that particular rule.
And I'll also throw out to the community as well. So don't make Daniel do all the work. So other community people who are out there as well, please, if you are looking at this tool, if you're using it, if you understand, if you go through and spend some time to learn how to build rules, please spend some time on the issues page and help Daniel resolve some of these other issues, and maybe provide some feedback and give back to the community a bit more around helping others solve their rule challenges as well. So we can all kind of jump on the bandwagon here and enhance everything here for the greater good of the community by contributing just a little bit at a time. So I want to encourage everyone else to kind of, those of you who are going to be able to catch on to this and be able to do it quickly, please jump in and help out.
Awesome. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go in and see some of the power of these best practice rules. So I'm going to fire up Tabular Editor here, now for the examples that I'm going to go through here, I'm just going to use an analysis services tabular model. But you could just as well connect Tabular Editor to an instance of Power BI Desktop currently running on your machine, load the model metadata from your Power BI data model into Tabular Editor, and have the best practice analyzer scan that model. Now, at this point, you might not be able to make any changes to your Power BI model through Tabular Editor, but you could still use the best practice analyzer to highlight if you have any mistakes that you should go and correct in Power BI Desktop. Again, for those of you using Power BI Premium, have access to the read-write XML endpoint, you could make the changes through Tabular Editor, and I highly recommend doing that for other reasons as well. But just know that the tool itself, or the best practice analyzer itself, is applicable even if you're just using plain old Power BI Desktop models without having the option of actually using Tabular Editor to edit those models. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to connect to my local instance of analysis services, where I happen to have a good old AdventureWorks database already pre-installed. And you can see, again, I'm not going to go over all the introductory stuff. We covered that the day before yesterday. But here you can see we have our AdventureWorks model loaded. And right now here at the bottom of the screen, it says we don't have any best practice issues at all. 0 BP issues. And now the reason for that is if I go up to the tools and go into the manage BPA rules area here, we'll see that it's because, well, right now we don't have any effective rules. So there are no rules actually scanning this model right now. So the first thing I want to do is I want to bring some rules into this into this model so that we actually have something that we can work on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the URL that I showed you before, so the raw URL for this JSON file here. So I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to go over to Tabular Editor and click the little add button over here. And then you can see I have a couple of options here for how to add rules or actually how to add a collection of rules to this model. So either I can decide to create a new rule file. So this would just be a local JSON document that I can place somewhere where I can start to build my rules one by one. I could also include a local rule file. So if I have a rule JSON file already on my machine somewhere, or if I have it on a network share, then I can choose that option and just point to the file and get it in here. Or the last option is that I can include the rule file from a URL. So that's the one we're going to use here. Pasting in the URL of the JSON file and clicking OK. And immediately you can see that the lower window here gets populated with all of these rules. And these rules are basically passed out from the JSON file that we just included. You can see here where it says collection, we can see that, okay, so since I'm right now looking at all of the effective rules hitting my model, so these could be rules coming from different places, but right now I only have them from the external JSON file on GitHub. But this just lets you provide an overview over all the rules that you have. So another thing you can do is you can go into each of these collections. So for example, these are the rules that are currently living within the model itself. So rules that have been defined as annotations on the model itself. As we can see, we don't have any of those. This is the one we imported from GitHub. And then as I mentioned in the presentation, you could have some rules that are available only for you as the current local user on the machine, or even rules that are shared across all developers in the machine. The location for these files, if you're curious about how that works, is if you go into your Explorer and you type percentage sign local app data percentage sign, like I did here. You get into this special folder which belongs to your user. And within this folder, you'll see there's another folder called Tabular Editor. And this contains all kinds of settings and files specific to Tabular Editor. And you can see one of these files is called BPA rules.json. And this is basically the rules file for you as a local user on this machine. If I open this file in a text editor, we can see that right now it's completely empty. It's just an empty JSON array. And this explains why I didn't see any rules when I looked through this collection inside Tabular Editor. So what you can do is you can either start to fill out this file with some rules. If you really like typing JSON manually, that's the way to go. But I suggest instead of doing that, go to the Tabular Editor UI and simply click, use this interface to create the rule. So if you want to create a rule from scratch, you click here on the new rule button. And you can see based on where I put my cursor up here, you can put the rule into different collections. So you'll notice that if I click on this external URL, you can see that now all the buttons here at this area, they're all grayed out. And that's because since this is an external file living on some URL on GitHub, then you're not able to, at least from this interface, add new rules to this interface or edit the existing rules, anything like that. So in order to create new rules, you'd have to either go to the rules within the current model. In this case, they will be added as rules within the annotations, or you could add them to the local user file or the local machine file. In that case, you can see now the new rule button lights up. So just for sake of the example, let's just go ahead and create a simple rule here. Let's type it, let's call it hi Mike. And let's just put whatever category here, doesn't really matter. Put some description. And finally, you can see here we get this error message saying expression expected. And that's because we have to provide an expression for these rules to even be validated. So we could simply type true here. And in that case, we would get a rule which is always in violation because, well, true is always true. So if I do that, and click OK, and you can see now we have this whatever rule here, hi Mike, on the model scope with severity level 1, and now this rule lives in my local user file, or at least as soon as I click OK, we should be able to see that now this BPA rules JSON file, if I reopen it in Programmer's Notepad here, you can see that now we actually have the JSON definition of this rule that I just created. Okay, so it's a lot easier to manage your rules from inside this tool than by manually going through all of these JSON files and making changes to them. Now, for this particular rule I just created, it's not really that interesting. You can see when we open up the list of rules, of objects that are currently in violation, you can see the moment we added or clicked OK on the manage rule dialog, this guy down here tells us that now we have 106 best practice issues. So this is basically the count of the number of objects that are in violation of any of the rules that we have currently defined. And if I click this link down here, it opens the best practice analyzer window, which is just a tool window that you can place anywhere on your monitor, wherever you like to see this stuff. And we can see up here at the top, we have the hi Mike rule that we created. And this shows us that, okay, so right now our model object is in violation. And guess what? It's always going to be in violation of this rule, since the expression that we assigned here was simply just, true. So this always evaluates to true, and therefore our model will always be in violation of this rule. Now, if we type false here instead, you can probably already guess what happens. The moment I click OK, and I save my rule file by clicking OK here as well, you can see that now this guy disappears from the list of objects that are in violation. So that's sort of the ultra brief introduction to the dynamic link expression language, where true is true and false is false. And then of course you can type any other link expression that you can think of. All you need to keep in mind is that it should evaluate to a Boolean expression, so either true or false. If it evaluates to true, well, then you are going to get an object to show up in the list of objects that are in violation of best practice analyzer rules. If it evaluates to false, well, then Tabular Editor does not consider that particular object as being in violation. So to give you some inspiration of the kind of rules that you can create here, you can see that right now we have 105 best practice issues. I'm going to collapse the list up here by clicking this little button, and then we can sort of see the violations grouped by the rule of which they are violating. And just starting from the top, you can see the very first rule that we specify here is column references should be fully qualified. And if Marco Russo happens to be watching this webinar, I know that he will be very happy, because this is one of his pet peeves, that whenever you're writing a DAX code and you're referencing a column inside your DAX expression, you must always remember to put the table name in front of the column name. That's just, you know, there's no discussion. You always have to do that. And Marco has a very good video where he explains why you need to do that. But now there's also a best practice rule that helps you ensure that you always live up to that. So in this case, we can go in and we can look at the various objects. So in this case, we have 18 measures and a couple of columns that are actually violating this rule. And if you simply just double click on one of them, like I'm doing now, the Tabular Editor UI will navigate to that particular object that you clicked on, and then can see its expression of in the expression editor. And sure enough, this guy takes the sum of the sales amount column. And what we forgot in this case was to add internet sales, so the name of the table in front of the column name. As soon as I accept this change, we should see that, hey, now we only have 19 objects in violation. So now we fixed one of these issues, right? And the same thing goes for, you know, there's a couple of calculated columns here. If I double click any of those, we can see the same issue. So here we have the gross profit calculated column, which has this DAX expression. And sure enough, once again, we forgot to put the table names in front of the column names, which we should always do whenever we're writing DAX code. So let me put that here. Let's hit the accept change button again. And sure enough, now we only have 18 objects in violation of this rule. And so you could move on like this, fixing all the various issues you have. And I'm pretty sure you get the idea at this point. Let's go in and look at what the actual expression for this particular rule looks like, so you can get an idea for the expression language behind this. So in this case, since this rule came from our external collection of rules, the JSON file that we downloaded from GitHub, unfortunately we can't edit the rule from in here. You can see if I find the rule in this list, column references should be fully qualified, we can see that the edit rule button is still disabled. However, what we can do is we can actually copy this rule over to one of the collections that we are able to modify. So what I'm going to do here, also for purposes of some of the next samples I'm going to show you, is I'm just going to copy everything from this collection. So I'm going to click the move to button here. And then we can decide, okay, where do we want to move these rules? And since these rules are coming from an external file, we're not really physically moving them, we're just copying them to somewhere else. And we can decide if we want to copy the rules inside the current model, inside the local user file, or to the local machine file. So in this case, I'm just going to copy them to the current model. We hit OK. And then something strange happens. Now you can see all of these rules are now striked out like this. And this basically means that, okay, remember a moment ago in the presentation, I talked about what happens if you have multiple rules with the same ID from different collections. Well, now we are hit by the precedence thing. And the thing is, if we go to the rules within the current model, you can see now we have identical rules specified in here, but now they're no longer striked out. And that's because rules that are defined within the model itself take precedence over any rules that are defined externally. And you can actually, if you have multiple rules from external sources, you can actually order the precedence by using the two buttons here, up and down arrows, to change the precedence order of these rules. But keep in mind, this only affects rules that have the same name. Sorry, not the same name, the same ID across different collections. So if I go in here to the rules within my current model, and I go to this column references should be fully qualified guy, and I edited this rule. Let's say for now, the only thing I want to change is the ID. So I go up here in the ID field, I put a little _2 just to make this this unique, like this, and then I click OK. We can see that now, if we go back to our external rules, now this guy is no longer striked out. So now we actually have these rules in effect both on from the external file, but also from the rules that are defined within the current model. And to get an overview over all the rules that are actually effectively hitting your model right now, that's when you click on the effective rules option here at the top. And now, sure enough, we can see that now this guy appears twice, because behind the scenes they now have different IDs, so Tabular Editor is treating them as two different rules. And you can also see here in the collection where the rules are originating from. Okay. So let's take another look at the rule itself, the expression of the rule. So you can see that in this case we have a slightly more complex expression than we did before. First of all, you'll notice that this rule applies to all of the calculated columns in your model, all the calculated tables, all your KPIs, all your measures, and at some point I should probably make sure that this applies to calculation items as well. In fact, let's just hit that right now. And the expression for this rule is that, so it's a little difficult to read when you're not used to working with this dynamic link syntax, but basically what's going to happen here is that Tabular Editor is going to iterate through all of the objects in your model that are of the type that we specified in the dropdown. So for each of the calculated columns, for each of the calculated tables, calculation items, measures, and so on, it's going to evaluate this expression. And basically this expression said, okay, if this particular object depends on any column, that's where we have the key object type equals column, and at the same time it's this reference, DAX reference, is not fully qualified. So fully qualified means that you put the table name in front of the column name. Well, then we want to report this object as being in violation of this particular rule. So that's how we detect if people made this mistake in their DAX code. It's not by actually passing the DAX or anything like that. We don't want to do that because Tabular Editor already did that for us when it built the dependency tree of all the objects. So we can just use the information available in the dependency tree. And that's basically what this guy here gives us. Depends on, it's basically a list of all objects that any object is referencing. So we just use that information to understand if there are any column references that are not fully qualified. So that's what this rule here is giving us. And sure enough, we already saw that it worked. And once I corrected the DAX expressions around the model, things started to work, and our list of violations got shorter. So let me show you another simpler example of a rule that we can create. So I have another one here called revisit to-do expressions. And before I show you the expression, let me show you what the rule itself does. So if we go over here, we can see we have a single object here that are in violation of this rule, reseller current quarter gross profit. So if we double click on that guy, we can see its expression. And here you'll notice that, okay, for some reason the developer here put a comment into this DAX expression. So apparently he's asking the question if whether anyone is actually using this measure at all. And since he has this to-do word inside the expression, that's what the rule here is actually catching for us. So if we go and have a look at the expression here. Oh, so I think I forgot to hang on. So I think I may have lost the rules here. So let's go to rules within the current model, and let's hit OK. And now we have now we should be able to go in. Yep. So now I'll just go ahead. Once again, I'm looking at rules within the current model because that way I'm able to edit the rule definition. So I'm going to click on the revisit to-do expressions rule and click on the edit rule button over here. And now take a look at the expression that we have here. So basically it says that, okay, so for the particular types of objects that I've selected here, so once again, calculated columns, calculated tables, measures, and other stuff that can contain an expression, we are going to look at the expression property of those objects in order to see if this string contains the word to do. And now this syntax here with the index of, that's some C# specific stuff, because there's also another C# function called contains, but the problem with that is that it is case sensitive. So if we wanted to do a case insensitive comparison of whether the expression string contains the word to do, well, then we have to do something like this, where we use index of and provide this argument here to the index of function. Again, this is just C# specific stuff. And we need to look for situations in which to do the index, the character index of the word to do inside the expression string is greater than or equal to 0, because this means that the to do string is actually inside the expression string somewhere, and that's all we want this rule to do, basically. So that's another example. Another one that I'm always eager to show people is this guy here. Don't summarize numeric columns. And I believe we had this discussion the day before yesterday, or maybe it was yesterday, I forget, about always making sure that you have explicit measures in your Power BI models.
Yeah, this was yesterday. We talked about this yesterday. So when you're developing Power BI models or models in general, Power BI can handle an implied measure, meaning just grabbing a column that is a numerical value and bringing it onto the canvas where you build your reports. However, Excel does not like implied measures, so it needs everything to be explicitly called out.
Exactly, and this is indeed what this rule is trying to catch. So basically, the rule here is that, okay, let's say you have a numeric column somewhere on your model, which happens to be visible to the end user. So you didn't hide the column, but the data type of the column is numeric. By default, what Power BI will let you do is drag that column directly into the canvas and create what Mike said is called an implicit measure. Now, this is bad, and one of the reasons it's bad is that Excel users won't be able to use this measure when they're browsing the model using a pivot table. But one of the other reasons that this is bad is that implicit measures will not work with calculation groups. So if at a later point you decide to add calculation groups to your model, well, then your reports won't work with them. So a best practice is to always create explicit measures. And that actually is completely equivalent to saying, hey, your model shouldn't have any visible numeric columns. If you must have a numeric column in there somewhere which is visible to the end user, well, then there's a property that you need to set on that column to indicate to Power BI that it shouldn't summarize, it shouldn't aggregate this particular column. So one example is, let's say you have on your date table, you have a year column, and it's very natural for the year column to be numeric. 2019, 2020, and so on, and perfectly fine to have a numeric data type on that column, but you would never want to actually aggregate the numbers inside that column. So it doesn't make the sense to take the sum of the contents of the year column, right? So what you normally do in that situation inside Power BI Desktop, you go and say there's this summarize by option, and you go and you set it to none or don't summarize, or I forget exactly what it's called inside Power BI Desktop.
I think it's technically do not summarize.
Do not summarize. Yeah, that's what it's called. But basically, this is just a property available on every single column that you can set the default summarization to either be sum or min or max. But the lesson here is that we actually want to set across every column of our model, we actually want to set this property to do not summarize, because we don't want our users to summarize columns directly. We want to always create explicit measures. And basically the rule here says that, okay, so if you have a visible column and that column is of a numeric data type, well, then you should set the summarize by property to do not summarize. In the tabular model itself, the property is slightly different, or at least the names. So let me go into one of these. Let me go to the internet sales freight column here. So this is a column on the internet sales table. And you can see down here in the property grid, it should be here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. You can see it has this summarize by property, which is currently set to default. And default would let the client tool just summarize this column by dragging it into the canvas. I believe Power BI would just take the sum of the values of this column, which doesn't make any sense. So what we want to do is we want to set this guy to none instead. So in the tabular model, it's called none, but this is the same as setting it to do not summarize in Power BI Desktop. So as soon as we set this guy to none, you can see that it disappears from the list over here. We now no longer have the freight column showing up. Now, this is an interesting example because to fix this issue, we only need to set a single property on the object. And that's one of the candidates. If you remember in the slides, I talked about some object violations can actually be fixed automatically. And this is exactly one of those. So you'll see that if you right click on any of these objects, you can see that you have some additional options available here, which are to either generate a fix script or to apply a fix. And that's possible whenever you have a rule in which, in order to fix the rule, you only need to set a single property on the respective object to another value. So basically, what we can do here is if I select a bunch of these objects and I right-click and I choose to generate a fix script. For those of you that saw my session yesterday, you'll see that, okay, so now we have a fix script copied into the clipboard. If we now paste it into the advanced script editor, we can take a look at what it actually does. So let's click OK here. Let's go to advanced scripting, and I'm just going to hit Control V in order to paste this in. And zooming in here a little bit so you can see what's going on. So basically, what this script now does is it lists all of the objects that we just selected a moment ago in the best practice analyzer view. And for each of these objects, you can see that it's just setting its summarize by property to aggregate function none. And this is just completely equivalent to setting this same property through the UI. This is just how to do it through a script instead of that. So at this point, we can either choose to just execute the script, in which case it'll fix the issue for all of these objects that I selected here. Let me just do that just to show you that it works. So I'm going to hit the little run button up here. And you can see now immediately these guys disappeared from over here. But actually, there's no reason to generate the script at all, because we could also just invoke the script directly from in here by clicking on Apply Fix. So for the remaining 5 columns, I'm just going to hit this button here. And now we can see all of these guys disappeared. And if we now go into one of these guys, so I forget which ones we just did, but that's okay. We can just undo. So we can undo that the BPA fix was applied. So if I undo that, you can see now these guys show up here again. Okay, so one of them was employee base rate, this guy here. So let's go and have a look at that. So employee base rate, right now you can see the summarized by property has been set to default. So keep an eye on that. Once I apply a fix for these objects, you can see now it magically changed to none. And that's exactly what we wanted to do.
This is incredible. The fact that you can go so fast with this is blowing my mind right now. This is really, really cool. And I would also say Daniel has a couple times here when he's been working in these models, he's been showing you how it works, and he hits Control Z. You can't hit Control Z in Power BI Desktop to get back your measure or unbreak something. This is so. I think maybe I'm looking at this and thinking maybe the unsung hero of entirely Tabular Editor is the fact that I can Control Z and come back to something that I just messed up. This is really, really awesome. Really love that. Yeah. Awesome.
Absolutely, and this feature has actually been in Tabular Editor from the very beginning. It was actually designed around being able to undo any changes that you made, because I was so sick of Visual Studio not having this feature. So I used to build tabular models in Visual Studio, and whenever I made a mistake, there was no way to go back. You just have to, redo whatever
what you did. You're so hesitant to make any kind of changes. This is amazing. So yeah, so the unsung hero is Control Z or Control Z. That's amazing. Awesome. Absolutely. All right, sorry, I didn't mean to stop you there.
Yeah, no, but actually, let's see. Are there any questions at this point? Because it's a good.
We have 2 questions. So it says you were using fully qualified earlier on. Mm-hmm. Is this a constant value defined in a tabular editor, or is this something C# specific?
Right. So that's a good question, and I believe that you're referring to this expression that I showed you earlier, where it says fully qualified here.
Yes.
And this is not a C# specific feature. I can say that right away. So the way this works is that when I talked yesterday about how we are using the tabular object model with C# and we can go in and manipulate objects like setting descriptions, format strings, all that kind of stuff. based on the properties and the object hierarchy available in the Tabular object model. That was actually not the entire truth, because there's one additional layer to this, and this is something that I created. I call it the Tom wrapper. So basically, it's a code library that sits around the Tabular object model and enriches it with all sorts of useful features. And one of these features and properties that we can call is this fully qualified guy that you see right here. Another one is this guy over here, the depends on, which builds the dependency hierarchy between all of the DAX expressions in your model. And so there are various of these tidbits. And so unfortunately, it's probably very difficult to find the documentation on this stuff online, because as I said, it's something that I created. It only lives inside this Tom wrapper library that ships with Tabular Editor. So I'm afraid that for now you'll have to look into some of these examples, some of the existing rules that are available, and get your inspiration from there. Or feel free to ask a question on the GitHub side if there's something specific you want us to do. I'll be happy to provide an example. Maybe there's already an easy way to do it, thanks to the Tom wrapper, like with using the fully qualified stuff. Otherwise, you may have to do some more work in the expression editor to express what it is that you want the rule to do. But in any case, let me know. I'll be happy to assist with getting the right expression up and running.
Perfect. We had one other question here. Do we need to install something besides Tabular Editor to use these rules?
Nope, not at all. Everything ships with the Tabular Editor. So the only thing you need to do, as I showed in the beginning, is that you need to import the rules from somewhere. And I suggest using as a starting point the rules in the URL that I showed here. It's also in the slide deck. There's a link to this, so you can find it there. And adding this as a rule collection to get you started.
Excellent, good question. We had another person here. Chris said, "Fixed script is awesome." He loves the fact that you can fix the script in line right there. And I think this is an amazing feature as well. I totally agree with this statement. I think this is one of the strengths that we're seeing here from the best practice analyzer, right? This is the story that we're trying to convey with any of our Power BI reports. We have something that is alerting us. We need to take action, and we need to resolve the issue. And so this is a really good closed loop system of finding problems and fixing them. Yeah.
So as I said a moment ago, for Power BI Desktop, you won't necessarily be able to fix the issues through Tabular Editor, because Power BI Desktop will not support making any kind of change to your Power BI Desktop model. So for some of the issues that you're catching here, you may have to go back over to Power BI Desktop in order to fix the issue. But at least you can still, once you fix the issue in Power BI Desktop, you can just reconnect Tabular Editor to the Power BI Desktop model, and then immediately the best practice analyzer would show you if you still have any issues after doing that.
Great. No more questions. You can keep going if you'd like.
Cool. So I want to dive a little bit more into this guy that we just looked at, the don't summarize numeric columns, just so you can see how the expression for this guy looks. So I'm going to click on the edit rule button here again, and I'm just going to expand this a little bit, and I'm going to format this expression slightly just to make it a little more easier to read, and then we'll go over what it does. So zooming in here. Okay, so what you'll notice about this particular rule that I just demonstrated for you a moment ago is that this will only apply to columns of our model. So it'll apply to calculated columns, calculated table columns, and data columns. So these are the three different types of columns that you can have in a tabular model. And we need to select all three because we want this rule to apply to any kind of column in the tabular model. And the expression that we want to apply here is that we want this rule to apply to only columns that are not hidden, because if the column is hidden, we don't really care about it, because in that case, the end user is not going to create an implicit measure out of it if it's hidden. We also want to make sure that the table the column resides on is not hidden, because even if the column is visible, well, if the table it resides on is hidden, then the column is not going to show anyway. So for this rule to be able to catch columns that are potentially in violation, both the column itself has to not be hidden, and the same goes for the table. So basically meaning the column needs to be visible to the end user. At the same time, we're checking that the summarize by property is set to something other than none. So this would be either set to default or to a sum or min or max or any of that. And finally, we're going to let this rule apply only to columns that have a numeric data type. So that would be a data type of double, decimal, or int64, because these are the three numeric data types in the tabular model. These are the ones that by default Power BI would go and summarize if you drag them into the canvas. So if we have any columns that live up to all these criteria, well, then we want to report them as being in violation of this rule, and that we should go and do something about it. And in this case, what we want to do about it is that we want to set their summarize by property to none. Because once we do that, well, then this criteria here would no longer be satisfied, and then the column would stop showing up in the best practice analyzer. And now you'll notice that in this interface, unfortunately, there's no place where we can actually specify the fix expression, because you'll notice that in order to automatically fix this issue, we have to somewhere specify some kind of code that instructs Tabular Editor about what to do whenever it encounters this kind of column, and the user decides to generate a fix script or apply the script directly. Now, unfortunately, that's not possible using this UI. So if you want to make your own like fix expressions for these kind of rules, you'd have to go into the JSON definition of this model and do that. So let me show you how that looks. So since we copied all of the rules from the external collection into our local model, I'm just going to take this particular rule, so the don't summarize numeric column, and I'm going to copy that rule over to rules for the local user. So I'm going to click OK here and click OK another time here. And then if we go back to the location of the settings files and everything relating to Tabular Editor, you should see that in here. So now we have the BPA rules JSON file here. Let me open this in Programmer's Notepad. And again, let's enlarge a little bit. So up here at the top, we have the high mic rule that I created immediately just for show. And below that, you see we now have the don't summarize numeric columns rule, which is the one we just copied from being inside the model annotations itself, getting it out and putting it on the local users file here. And you'll notice that this contains all the information that we saw in the UI a moment ago. So we see the name, we see the description, and so on. The scope, meaning the types of objects that this rule should apply to, and also, of course, the link expression itself with all the, with the is hidden equals false and so on and so on. But lastly, there's one other thing here which is not exposed in the UI, and that's the fix expression property of this JSON document. So this guy here. And whenever this guy is specified, so you'll notice if you compare it to the rule here above where it's just set to null. So whenever you have a non-null expression here in the JSON, this will actually make the apply fix or generate fix script buttons light up inside the best practice analyzer, because once you specify an expression like this, it's just going to be appended to an object reference when it's generating the script. And you'll notice a moment ago when we saw the script that was generated from this, I believe I still have it here. You can see that this is actually just corresponding completely to the last part of the script does. So the object reference, meaning everything we have here here in front, that's just an object reference that uses the TOM to reference that particular object inside the Tableau object model. That's just generated by the best practice analyzer. But this part here that I highlighted with the rectangle, this is simply just the fix expression string that Tabular Editor just pasted in here, and that's all we need to do basically to fix the issue for this particular column. So that's why I said that automatically fixing the issues is something we can only do for very simple issues where it's only a matter of setting a single property on that object to a different value. That's when we can utilize the fix stuff here.
So when you're using the fixed property element here, essentially you're able to generate code for the first half of take this column and modify it, and then you're only appending in text whatever's in that JSON property that you're applying inside
yes.
the rule. So that makes a lot of sense then. So if we wanted to so you're basically writing your own object-based aggregation piece at the end of this and just
Yeah.
specifying, okay, at the end of this phrase, you need to do this specific thing and it'll fix it.
Yeah, and the format of this needs to, of course, adhere to C# syntax. So the first word here needs to be a valid or an existing property on the types of object that we are referencing. So, for example, if we had said something like, I don't know, some property that does not exist on a column like KPI or something like that, well, then we would get an error when generating, or not when generating the script, but when we try to apply the fix, because in that case, we would have something that does not make sense, that cannot be compiled against the Tableau object model. And whatever we have here on the right-hand side should just, be a single value that we can put into that property.
Makes sense.
So this text here is just directly copied into the script that gets generated, and then hopefully things will compile. Meaning that hopefully we'll end up generating a valid C# script that can be applied to our model.
Can you explain the compatibility level that you have in there? I see you have a 1200 model in there for one of these. What is that? What is that referring to, and how does that used inside the rules?
Right. So since whenever we get a new compatibility level of analysis services, it typically means that the product team has been adding new features to analysis services. So one example of that is the calculation group feature, which is only available on models that are of compatibility level 1500 or newer. And since these particular objects may have some properties that did not exist in previous compatibility levels, we want to tag our rule and say that, hey, this particular rule should only apply to models that are at a certain minimum compatibility level. Otherwise, we would likely get all kinds of errors, because we would be referring to properties and objects in our rule that don't even exist on that kind of model. And so we could get runtime errors when the rule engine is evaluating the rule expression. So we have some options here in this drop down. And I think I said compatibility level 1500 is what's needed for calculation groups. In fact, it's just, I don't know if anyone is using this, but one of the early previews of SQL Server 2019 used compatibility level 1470. So anything above 1470 should support calculation groups. So this is the option that you would choose for that.
Excellent, makes sense. Yeah, that definitely helps for versioning and looking through, making sure you're not applying rules in the wrong areas.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we're about running out of time here. I just want to put this last slide on the screen to reiterate one more time that even if you're using Power BI Desktop, you could still use the best practice analyzer already today, because the only thing you want out of your Power BI Desktop to run the best practice analyzer is the model metadata, which you can get. So even if you can't make any changes to your Power BI Desktop model through Tabular Editor, well, then you can still probably gain something from using the best practice analyzer to go and look and make sure that you adhere to certain conventions. And keep in mind that the rules I showed you here are sort of rules that should apply generally, broadly. So stuff like, always qualifying column references, setting the summarize by property as we just saw. But there could be, in your particular organization, there could be all other kinds of rules that would apply just for your team of developers. For example, you may want to create a rule that enforces certain naming conventions. So let's say if you always want to ensure that dimension tables are have the word dim in their name or whatever, you can create any kind of rule that inspects all the model metadata in order to detect if certain name patterns or whatever are in effect. And since the rule engine under the hood, it uses the whole .NET C# library, you can do stuff like validating names using regex, regular expressions, and there's a bunch of stuff you can do. So check it out, and for sure let me know if you have any questions. We still have time right now. We can take a couple of questions as well.
So I'm going to give the formal sign off here real quick so we can say thank you all for coming. So thank you very much for coming, Daniel. Appreciate your time. This is awesome. Again, really amazing tool. Another part of the tool that we didn't even know about. I love the fact that we can fix things and have them instantly change inside the model. That's going to be super helpful. Stay tuned in the next couple of months for Power BI. There will be the ability for you to start editing and modifying Power BI desktop files while they're open in desktop while using Tabular Editor. So stay tuned. That's coming in the next couple months. I did put a link in the chat window around Christian Wade's version of this, where he actually went through and demoed this as well. All right, so a couple questions here. We have Victor. He's asking which compatibility level is currently applying to Power BI Desktop?
Yeah, that's a good question, Victor. And the answer is it kind of depends on which version of Power BI Desktop you're running. So if you're using the latest version of Power BI Desktop, I believe the default compatibility level would be 1465. But in reality, it doesn't really add any new features that at least nothing that would impact the best practice analyzer. So in that case, you could just stick to running with compatibility level 1400 for your if you plan to create any best practice rules. Now, there's one slight detail about that, because if you're using the newest version of Power BI Desktop, you're probably already aware that we have this new preview feature here called Store Datasets Using Enhanced Metadata Format. And once you check out that, it'll actually bump your compatibility level up to, I believe, 1520. And this is one of the things that's needed in order for stuff like calculation groups and read-write XML endpoint connectivity, that kind of stuff to work. So the answer is it depends. But if you're curious and you want to know how it works, just keep in mind that you could always connect Tabular Editor to your Power BI Desktop file. So let me do that here. So either you could connect to a running instance of Power BI Desktop, or if you export the Power BI file to a Power BI template, you can load the template directly inside Tabular Editor. And here you will have the option of, when you go to the Model tab here, you'll see that there's this database property in the property grid. If you expand that, you can see that here it actually shows the compatibility level. So 1465 for this particular model.
Great question. Good answer. So can we set best practice analyzer rules on queries that are utilized to derive tables in our model?
Yes, so if I understand the question correctly, what you want to do is you want to inspect the partition queries on your models. So for example, in this case, since I'm just using a legacy data source, I don't have any M expression in here. It's just a regular SQL statement that I'm using to populate my table with data. And since this SQL expression is simply just, you can see it's available right here. The property is called query, and it's available on partitions. So basically, what we can do, if I should demonstrate this real quick, is just to, let's create a new rule here. And let's say, hey, we want to create a rule that applies to all our, not our model, but all our partitions. And we want to say, hey, this rule should contain something like query needs to start with select. I don't know, whatever, something that just.
I'd say it should say it doesn't say say the query does not contain select star, right? Because that's kind of like our big no-no in SQL land is don't do select star, call out the column. So can you do something where it says does not contain select star?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do something like this. We'll put a little not here in the front. Yep. So we say, okay, so if our query does not contain the word select space star, and keep in mind this is also case sensitive.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and add that. And we can see, hey, we actually have 24 partitions here that do not follow this pattern. So that's basically all of our partitions. And that's because if you'll notice, it actually says select and then the table name dot star. But let's just fix one of them to see if this actually works. And hey, what do you know? It actually disappeared. So let me try that one more time. Keep an eye on the 2010 partition here of internet sales. And then the moment I correct the select.star expression here and hit accept, you can see that now 2010 has disappeared from
fixed.
From the list.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And so let me ask another question around that one. So I think they may also be asking around not only just partitions, but let's say I have a calculated table. Could we also run this against a calculated table just to make sure that we cover all the bases here? Because partitions could be calculated, and I guess calculated tables could also reference the derived tables.
Yeah, so if you have a calculated table on your model, you would typically have some kind of DAX expression in here, right? So you may have something like, I don't know, summarize columns, whatever, and then it could be something like product color, And then, I don't know, you have a column called tests, which is basically the sum of internet sales amount, whatever. So this is a DAX expression that you would have in this column. Let's just save that. And now, so one point here is that for calculated columns, you can see right now it doesn't show as if this table does not have any columns on it. And that's because, as I also mentioned yesterday or the day before yesterday, Tabular Editor is not able to parse the DAX expression, so it cannot know which columns are going to come out of this DAX expression. So in order to get that, what we want to do is we want to save this change back to the analysis services database. So we hit save, and now we can see that, okay, now we have two columns on this calculated table, right? Color and tests. And now certainly for this expression here, we can do everything that we did, like similar to the partitions and some of the other examples I showed earlier, where we are looking into the DAX expression to make sure that column references are fully qualified and all that kind of stuff. That just works out of the box in the same way here.
Perfect. Excellent. And with that, we are finished with all the questions.
Okay, awesome.
Daniel, thank you very much. We're going to sign off and we're going to end the live stream here. Thank you everyone for participating and jumping in.